The station was built to make you feel small. That was the point. Varath 9 had been designed by the Thunari 400 years ago, back when they were the kind of civilization that built things to say something. The ceilings were 300 meters high. The floors were polished obsidian, the kind that reflected everything so perfectly that you were always walking above your own inverted ghost. The corridors were wide enough to fly a gunship through, and some of the older diplomatic wings had, once, served exactly that purpose. 40 species had a seat here. 40. The Galactic Coalition had spent 11 centuries knitting itself together out of war and grief, and the slow, grinding work of people who believed in something bigger than their own borders. It was not perfect. Nothing built by living things ever was. But it held. It had held for longer than most of its member species had been spacefaring. That was the thing about the Coalition that its critics always missed. It wasn't held together by law. It was held together by the memory of what happened when it fell apart. The hall where the summit convened was called the Chamber of First Words. Every species had named it something different in their own language. The Veth called it the Mouth of Peace. The Drakai had 17 syllables for it that didn't translate. The Thunari, who built it, had a word that meant something like the place where we stopped. In the common tongue used for coalition business, everyone just called it the chamber. It seated 4,000. Today it held something close to that. Every chair occupied, every gallery full, every observation deck behind its thick transparency pressed with bodies that had come from 100 star systems to watch this particular moment unfold. The lighting was warm and amber, the kind that made species with multiple eye types comfortable, and the sound system had been calibrated to carry every frequency that every voice in the room could produce. It was a room built for history. 3 humans walked into it. They came in through the delegate entrance on the east side, which was the smaller of the 2 main doors and historically used for junior delegations and observer states. The door was still 12 meters tall. The 3 humans who passed through it were, none of them, taller than 1.8 meters. They did not look up at the ceiling. They did not slow down to take in the scale of the room. They walked at the pace of people who had somewhere to be, and they sat down at the small table that had been assigned to them near the center of the floor. 1 table. 3 chairs, a small placard that read, United Nations Earth, Observer Status. The human at the center was a woman named Solis. No one in the room knew her rank, because she had no rank. She was a diplomat in the pure sense of the word, a person whose entire career had been the work of sitting in rooms where the terms were already decided, and finding the angle that made those terms survivable. She was not young and she was not old. She had gray in her hair that she had not tried to cover. She wore a dark jacket that had no decorations on it, and carried a single notebook, paper, not digital, and a pen. She set the notebook on the table. She set the pen on the notebook. She folded her hands and looked at the room. The man to her left was named Vance. He was the legal attaché. He had a tablet, 3 backup drives, and the expression of a person who had read every version of this particular treaty 17 times and found a different problem in it each time. He set his things on the table in a specific order. He looked at his tablet. He did not look at the room. The woman to Solis's right was Lieutenant Osei. She was, technically, a comms officer attached to the diplomatic corps. She had no tablet, no notebook, and no expression of any kind. She had a coffee thermos, the large kind, the one that held enough for a full shift, and she poured from it into a small cup and drank while the room filled. She looked, to anyone watching, like someone waiting for a bus. That was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. Admiral Ren Dakar arrived the way Dakar always arrived, with an entrance. He was Veth, which meant he was tall and pale, and moved with the angular precision of a species that had evolved on a world where stillness was how you survived. His robes were the deep blue of Coalition High Command, trimmed with the silver thread that indicated his rank, and he walked through the main doors, the large ones, the ones that were 20 meters tall and took 4 staff members to operate, with the measured unhurry of a person who has never in his life had to wait for anything. He was followed by a staff of 31. He sat at the head table, which was elevated by 6 steps above the floor level, and he looked down at the room with the expression of a person surveying something they had already decided about. His gaze passed over the human table. It lingered for perhaps half a second longer than the other tables. Then it moved on. The session opened with the ritual reading of the Coalition Founding Compact, which took 40 minutes because it had to be read aloud in the 7 original languages simultaneously. Solis listened with her hands still folded. Osei poured a second cup of coffee. Vance found a new problem in the treaty and made a note. Then Dakar spoke. He had a good voice. The translator earpieces that every delegate wore rendered it in their own language, but the original Veth was a language built for authority, deep, carrying, with a cadence that moved like water finding a downhill path. He welcomed the delegates. He acknowledged the gravity of the moment. He spoke for some time about the coalition's long history of careful, considered expansion, about the principles that had guided every membership decision across 11 centuries, about the responsibility that came with stewardship of the galaxy's most enduring institution. He spoke well. He was, in the way of people who are always agreed with, not used to listening. When he got to humanity, he did not raise his voice. He did not lower it. He laid the words out flat, the way you lay a document on a table. This is what it says. This is what it means. There is nothing to discuss. Humanity's application for full coalition membership had been reviewed. It had been reviewed in full session, in closed committee, by 3 independent bodies. The review had taken 2 standard years. The conclusion, reached after considerable deliberation, was that humanity did not yet meet the criteria for full membership. He paused there. There was, across 4,000 bodies and 40 species, a very specific kind of silence. The kind that fills a room when no one is surprised but everyone is watching to see how the people being told take it. Dakar continued. Earth would be offered, instead, protected status. This was not a lesser designation, he was careful to say. It was, in fact, a designation that carried considerable benefits. It would grant humanity access to coalition trade networks, medical research exchange programs, and limited technology transfer agreements. It would establish a formal framework for humanity's integration into the broader galactic community. It would, in time, provide a pathway toward full membership once the relevant criteria had been met. He said what the relevant criteria were. There were 9 of them. He read them without rushing. At the human table, Vance was writing. His pen moved across his tablet with the speed of someone transcribing and annotating at the same time. Osei poured a 3rd cup of coffee. She drank it without looking at anything in particular. Solis listened. Her hands did not move. Her face did not move. She listened the way walls listen, without reaction, without give, without any indication that the sound was changing anything on the other side of it. When Dakar finished, he looked at the floor and asked, in the formal phrasing required by coalition procedure, whether the Earth delegation wished to respond. Solis unfolded her hands. She picked up her pen. She opened her notebook. She wrote one thing in it. Then she looked up. Admiral Dakar. Her voice was not loud. The room's acoustics did the work, carrying it to every corner. Is this offer final, as presented? Dakar looked at her. There was something in his expression, not dismissal, not contempt, something quieter than either of those. The expression of a person confronted with a question whose answer is so obvious that being asked it is its own kind of answer. It is, he said. Solis nodded once. She closed her notebook. She put the pen down on top of it, parallel to the spine, neat as a seam. She stood. Thank you, she said. I need to make a call. I'll be back within the hour. She said it the way a person says they're going to refill their water. Flat, practical, like the decision had already been made, before she stood up, and the standing was just the body catching up to it. She pushed her chair back, nodded to Vance, and walked toward the east side of the room, where the delegate comms terminals were mounted along the inner wall. She did not hurry. She did not look back. The room watched her go in the way. 4,000 people can watch one person without technically staring, heads not turning, eyes tracking sideways, a stillness that was louder than movement. Dakar watched her from the elevated table. His expression had not changed. His staff had not changed either. They had the collective composure of people who were very good at not reacting to things. One of them, a junior attaché at the far end of the table, leaned 3 centimeters toward the colleague beside her and said something in a register too low for the room to carry. The colleague smiled. It was a small smile, private, the kind that lives briefly on the face of someone who is certain of the outcome and finds the waiting mildly amusing. At the human table, Osei poured a fourth cup of coffee. She drank it. She looked at nothing. At the comms terminal on the east wall, Solis set her hand against the reader, waited for the authentication tone, and began to dial. The number she dialed was not a surface number. It was not a station-to-station relay. It was not anything that ran through Coalition infrastructure at all. It was a ship line, long range, encrypted to a standard that the Coalition did not officially recognize, because the Coalition's Cryptographic Council had reviewed it 8 months ago and quietly declined to comment on what they found. The call connected in 4 seconds. The voice on the other end said one word. "Commander." Solis said, "We're going to need you." A pause. Then, "Understood. Transit time, 11 hours." "Understood," Solis said. She ended the call. She took her hand off the reader. She stood for a moment in the quiet pocket beside the terminal wall, looking at the floor, not at anything on it. Then she smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, turned, and walked back across the chamber floor toward the small table with 3 chairs. She sat down. She put her notebook in front of her and her pen on top of it. She folded her hands. She waited. At the head table, elevated by 6 steps, Admiral Ren Decor watched her return, and then returned his attention to his staff. He had 31 people here. He had the backing of 40 species. He had 11 centuries of institutional history behind him, and a legal framework so thoroughly developed that it had its own sub-commentary. He was not thinking about the human diplomat. He was thinking about the afternoon session's schedule. He did not think about her call. He would think about it later. Later was 11 hours away. The recess was declared at the 3rd hour. Decor did not call it a celebration. He called it an administrative interval, which was the Coalition's way of calling things what they weren't. But the result was the same. The chamber doors opened, the gallery lights warmed, and 4,000 delegates from 40 species poured into the reception corridors, like water finding every available level at once. Loud, branching, inevitable. There were tables of food along the east wall. Real food, the imported kind. Each species staple laid out in neat sections with little marker flags. The Draci clustered near the fermented mineral blocks. The Veth stood in their precise angular groups, hands clasped, voices low. The Orun, all 7 delegates, massive and slow-moving as cooling lava, occupied a corner by themselves, and did not eat, and did not speak, which was normal for the Orun, and had taken newer species decades to stop finding alarming. Decor stood at the center of it. He was not eating. He was receiving. That was the word for it. Receiving. Species came to him in a loose, self-organizing queue, not a formal one. No one had arranged this, and said what they needed to say. Some offered agreement. Some offered congratulations. Some had small objections, procedural worries, the administrative friction of 40 governments trying to align. He handled each one with the same measured attention, the same unhurried courtesy, the same weight that said, "I have time for you," which was the most powerful thing a person in his position could say and be believed. He was, in the way of people who have never lost, very good at winning. Kelthun was not near Decor. He was not near anyone, which was both unusual and not unusual depending on which version of himself he was being on any given day. He was Thunari, which meant he was medium height, gray-skinned, and built with the spare economy of a species that had spent its formative evolutionary centuries hiding from things larger than itself. His eyes were large, adapted for low light, for reading environments at a distance, for finding the specific shape in the general dark that meant danger, or safety, or something worth watching. He was watching the humans. He had a plate of food he wasn't eating. He held it the way people hold plates at events when they want to look occupied, in one hand, slightly raised, tilted toward himself as though he was considering it. He was not considering it. He was standing 12 meters from the human table. They had not left their table, all 3 of them, which was itself the first thing, and he was watching. The woman, Solis, was writing in her notebook, not reviewing, not consulting Vance, who had his head down in his tablet, and was working with the focused exclusion of a man who has blocked out the party entirely, not looking around the room, not watching the crowd, not tracking Decor or the coalitions forming and reforming in the reception corridor. Writing. What she was writing, Kelthun could not see from 12 meters. The notebook was small, her handwriting was small, Her pen moved with the unhurried certainty of someone writing something they already know, something being transferred from memory to page, rather than composed. That was not what he was watching. He was watching the other one, Osei. She had moved her chair slightly to the side, so that the edge of the table was not between her and the room. Both feet flat on the floor. Both hands around the coffee thermos. Not gripping it, holding it the way you hold something familiar, the way you hold something you've held so many times the hand knows the weight before the brain registers the pickup. She was looking at the room. That was what was wrong. Thun had been watching people at diplomatic events for 22 years. He knew what people looked like when they were watching a room. They tracked movement. They found faces they recognized. Their eyes snagged on the Dakar cluster, on the species delegations doing their careful social math, on the food tables. Their gaze had motion in it, pattern. Osei's gaze had none of that. She was not tracking movement. She was watching the room the way you watch a door you are waiting for someone to come through. Still, patient, oriented. The coffee thermos went up, came down. Her eyes did not move. She was waiting for something. Thun had studied humanity. He had done it the way some of his colleagues studied anomalous deep space objects, at a distance, with proper instruments, with the specific care of a person who suspects the thing they're looking at is larger than the current frame can hold. He had read their history, which was the kind of history that made Thunari historians go quiet, in a way they wouldn't explain. He had read their military doctrine, which was sparse, plainly worded, and structured around a principle that most coalition species spent their entire strategic philosophy trying to avoid. The principle was, absorb, adapt, and then do not stop. Not press forward, not strike back. Do not stop. He had read that and put it down and then picked it up again 3 days later, which was not something he did with documents. He thought about it now, watching Osei not move at the human table, while 4,000 beings moved around her. He picked up his untouched plate of food and walked toward her. She looked at him when he was 4 meters away. Not a reaction, a registration. The way a ship's sensor acknowledges a contact without changing course. He stopped at a conversational distance. Coalition custom. She did not stand, which he had not expected her to. Lieutenant Osei, he said. His common tongue was very good. 22 years. Officer Thun, she said. Her common tongue was also very good. She pronounced his name with the second syllable slightly elongated, which was the Thunari way, and not how most non-Thunari said it. He had not told her that. He noted that. You are not with the others, he said. No, she said. He waited. She did not add to it. He looked at the empty chair across the table. Solis's chair, abandoned, its occupant still writing. May I? Osei looked at the chair, then back at him. She shrugged with one shoulder, which was a human gesture he had catalogued as meaning, yes, but I'm not promising conversation. He sat. Your delegation is taking the decision calmly, he said. Yes, she said. Some of the others expected more visible reaction. I know, she said. He looked at his plate. He moved something on it with his fork. Diplomat Solis's call, he said, and kept his voice level and merely curious, the tone of someone making light conversation at a reception. What was it for? Osei turned the thermos in her hands once. A slow rotation. She looked at it while she did this, as if checking the label. Backup, she said. Thun kept his fork moving. He was very good at keeping his fork moving. What kind? Osei looked up from the thermos. She looked at him for a moment. Not long. Not the look of someone deciding whether to trust. The look of someone who has already decided, and is just letting the moment breathe before it moves on. She poured coffee into her cup. She drank it. She didn't answer. Thun set his fork down. He set his plate on the table beside the thermos, carefully, taking up as little space as he could, and he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, the 300-meter ceiling, the one that bent the light and made everything below it feel proportional to something other than itself, and he breathed in once through his nose. The Thunari had a word for the feeling of knowing something before you can prove it. The closest translation in common tongue was something like the smell before the storm, but that wasn't right either, because the Thunari word had a physical component to it, the specific sensation in the large eye of seeing a shape in low light that resolves, before the brain catches up, into the shape of something large. He was having that sensation now. He looked back down from the ceiling. Osei had refilled her cup. She was looking at the room again. The same door-watching patience. The same held stillness. He looked at the room with her for a moment. Then he said, quietly, in Thunari, something that did not have a good common tongue equivalent, but landed somewhere between, I hope I'm wrong, and I don't think I'm wrong. She didn't respond to it. She probably didn't speak Thunari. Almost no one did. He picked his plate back up. He stood. He nodded to her once. She nodded back. He walked back into the crowd, which swallowed him the way crowds swallow single people. Absorb, close, continue. The sensor operator on the Coalition patrol vessel Varath was a Drakai named Sun Vei, and she had been running standard sweep rotations in the Varath system for 6 hours without anything worth filing. The Varath system was quiet. It was always quiet. It was chosen for summits specifically because it was quiet. No major shipping lanes, no contested resource belts, no territorial proximity to anything that anyone wanted badly enough to do something about. She ran the sweep. She ran it again. The third sweep returned a reading that made her blink all 3 of her secondary eyelids in sequence, which was involuntary, which she had not done since she was a child. She checked the instruments. She ran a diagnostic. The diagnostic came back clean. She ran the sweep a 4th time. The reading was still there, larger than the 3rd sweep. Not much larger, but larger. She stared at it. The numbers were not producing a shape she recognized. Not a ship class she had in the recognition database, and the Varath's recognition database contained every vessel class in Coalition space plus 400 years of archived historical records. Not a natural object. The mass signature was wrong, too regular, too structured, with the specific internal geometry of something that was built. Not debris, not a station. Something that had not been there 6 hours ago. She tagged the reading. She flagged it to her senior officer. She kept staring at her screen with all 3 secondary eyelids doing the thing she couldn't make them stop doing, and she thought about sending a broader alert, a system-wide ping, and then she thought about how that would look if this turned out to be a sensor artifact, a calibration error, a piece of rock with an unusual mineral composition. She kept watching. The reading grew. Not fast, not alarming. The way a tide rises, the kind of change that, if you watch it with full attention, you can see happening, a centimeter at a time, in a direction that has only one destination. She sent the broader alert. Then she sat back in her chair, and she watched, and she waited, and she did not know what she was waiting for, and that was the part that made her secondary eyelids keep moving. Back in the reception corridor, the party continued. Dakor was still receiving. The queue had thinned but not dissolved. Species clustered and separated, and clustered again. The fermented mineral blocks were half gone. Someone had brought out a second round of the Veth sparkling water, which was served cold enough to ache. At the human table, Solis closed her notebook. She put her pen on top of it, parallel to the spine, and folded her hands, and sat back, and looked at nothing in particular. Vance looked up from his tablet. He said something to her too low to carry. She shook her head once. He went back to his tablet. Osei poured the last of the thermos into her cup. She drank it. She looked at the empty thermos for a moment. She set it down. She looked at the room. She waited. 11 hours was a long time. It was also, in the context of certain things, no time at all. The distance between a thing being possible and a thing being present was only ever a matter of physics and will, and the universe had been accommodating those 2 ingredients in combination for longer than any species in the room had been counting. The sensors on 14 Coalition vessels in the Varath system were now all reading the same thing. None of them had a name for it yet. In 6 hours they would. In 6 hours, the name for it would arrive at 300,000 kilometers and hold position 200 kilometers from the station, and then the name would not matter, because the thing itself would be there, and things that are present do not require names to be understood. But that was 6 hours away. For now, there was only the party. And at a small table near the center of the chamber of first words, a woman with gray in her hair sat with her hands folded and looked at nothing, and the quiet around her had the specific texture of a held breath, and no one in the room was paying attention to it. No one except Kelthun. He stood near the Drakai cluster with his untouched plate, and his large, low-light eyes, and he watched her, and the smell before the storm feeling had not gone away. It was getting stronger. It did not announce itself. That was the first thing. The thing that every sensor operator in the Varath system would talk about later, in the reports, in the debriefs, in the quiet corners of mess halls where people go when they need to say something that the official record doesn't have a box for. It did not send a hail. It did not broadcast a transponder signal. It did not come in slow, the way vessels approaching a neutral station are required to by coalition docking law. It did not do any of the things that anything with a hull and an engine is supposed to do. It arrived. One moment the sector of space 200 kilometers off Varath 9's primary docking face was empty. The standard empty, the calibrated empty. The empty that 14 patrol vessels had been sweeping on rotation for 6 hours and finding exactly what they expected to find, which was nothing. Then it was not empty. No flash, no displacement wave, no thermal bloom from a drive cooling down. Those things happen when a ship drops out of faster-than-light travel. They are the evidence of the physics involved, the bruise the universe takes when something moves through it at that speed. Every ship leaves them. It is not optional. The unces, gravitas, left none. It was simply not there. And then it was there. And the universe between those two states had apparently decided not to record the transition. The first alert went out from the Enderath at 4 seconds after arrival. By 6 seconds, all 14 patrol vessels had confirmed the contact. By 8 seconds, the contact had been cross-referenced against the recognition database, all of it, 400 years of records, and returned no match. By 10 seconds, the Enderath senior officer had the read on his screen, and he looked at it, and he said nothing, and he kept looking at it. By 12 seconds, the alert had reached the station. The lights in the reception corridor did not change. There was no alarm. No announcement. The music that someone had piped into the space, something low and multi-tonal, designed to be inoffensive across 17 auditory ranges, kept playing. The food tables were still half full. Delegates were still talking, still clustering, still doing the slow orbital dance of politics in a room where the stakes have already been decided. Then the first personal comm units started chiming. Not all at once. One here, two there. A trickle that became a stream, that became, in about 45 seconds, every device in the room going off in its owner's frequency simultaneously, which was 40 species worth of alarm tones layering on top of each other, into something that had no name but landed in the body as danger. Heads came up. Conversations stopped. Dakar's personal aide materialized at his elbow and said 3 words into his left ear. Dakar went very still. That was notable. Dakar was always still. The Veth kind of still, controlled, precise. The stillness of a body that was taught from childhood to move only with intention. This was a different still, the kind that happens when the ground drops out from under the thing you were standing on, and the body has not yet decided what to do about gravity. He said 1 word to his aide. His aide moved fast. Dronsis. The observation deck on the station's outer ring was 3 corridors and an elevator from the reception hall, and Kelthun ran all of it. He was not the only one running, but he was faster than most, because Thunari legs were built for speed, in the way their eyes were built for dark. Emergency adaptation, the legacy of a world that did not forgive slowness. He got to the observation deck before the crowd hit the corridor behind him, and he pressed himself against the transparency and looked out. He saw the patrol vessels first, all 14 of them, repositioned, weapons arrays live. He could see the glow of charged emitters even at distance, even through the station's outer ring of light pollution. They had formed something that was not quite a perimeter and not quite an attack formation, a shape that didn't have a tactical name because it had been designed in the last 30 seconds by 14 captains, all reacting to the same impossible contact, and none of them coordinating with the others. They were pointed outward, away from the station, toward something. Kelthun followed the line of their aim. He found it. The transparency he was pressing his face against was 1 centimeter of composite material, rated for vacuum and minor debris impact, and it did not flex or shudder, or give any physical indication of what was happening outside, and none of that mattered because his legs went soft anyway, the specific soft of a body that has processed something faster than the mind has, and is trying to make the mind pay attention. It was black. Not the black of space. Space was not really black up close. It was the specific deep dark blue of depth, scattered with light, textured with distance. This was a different black, a surface black, the black of something that had been built to absorb and return nothing. It sat against the star field like a hole cut in it, like someone had taken the shape of the largest thing Kelthun had ever seen and filled it in with the absence of everything. He could not see the edges of it clearly. That was the part that made his legs go soft. He could not see the edges. He pressed his face closer to the transparency and looked left. More of it. He looked right. More of it. He looked up, which required tilting his head back at an angle that his neck registered as mildly uncomfortable, and the upper hull of the gravitas was still there, still going, its dorsal line cutting across the starfield at a height that his brain could not accurately calculate, because the brain needs a reference point to calculate scale, and there was no reference point, because the only objects near it were 14 coalition patrol vessels, and against the hull of gravitas. Those 14 ships looked like the kind of debris you find in a shower drain. He stopped trying to find the edges. He breathed. Somewhere behind him in the corridor, he could hear the crowd arriving, the sounds of bodies and voices, and the specific frequency of mass alarm, which is not loud so much as layered, dozens of registers of distress stacking on each other into a wall of sound that has no single source. He did not turn around. He kept looking at the thing outside. It was not moving, not drifting, not rotating on any axis. It had arrived at a specific position, and it was holding that position with the absoluteness of something that had decided where it wanted to be, and had no opinion about the 14 armed vessels currently pointing at it. The hull was dark and it was still, and it was so large that the station, Varath 9, which had been built to make things feel small, was, next to it, the thing that felt small. Kelthun's lips moved. He was saying something in Thunari. He did not know he was saying it until he heard his own voice under the crowd noise. He processed what he had said. The closest translation in common tongue was something like, "They were always this." He had meant it as a thought. It turned out it was also true. On the bridge of Unswe, gravitas, Commander Mara Voss stood at the center of the command deck and looked at her screens. The bridge was large. Not large by the scale of the ship. By the scale of the ship, the bridge was a small room near the top of a structure that was approximately 2.6 kilometers long and 800 meters across the beam, a number that the Coalition's recognition database had returned when it was attempting to estimate dimensions because it had no direct reference file to pull from. The bridge was large by the scale of human things, by the scale of a room that needed to hold 40 people in combat conditions and give them all room to work without stepping on each other. Voss was not tall. She was a medium-height woman, with short hair, going gray at the temples, and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have made a lot of decisions in rooms where the wrong decision ended badly. She wore the dark uniform of the UN Space Command's Titan Division, which had no decorations on it beyond rank insignia, because the Titan Division had decided some years ago that the people who flew these ships did not need their chests telling the room what they had done. The room knew. She looked at the tactical screen, 14 contacts, arrayed in the improvised non-formation she had already identified as fear rather than strategy. Their weapons were live. She could see the charge signatures. She noted which of the 14 had the most aggressive energy output, which of the 14 had positioned themselves with the most options for retreat, which of the 14 was the one that, if this went badly, would be the first to make a choice that forced everyone else to make one too. She catalogued all of this. She did not move. Her comms officer, a young man named Park, on his first Titan posting, still in the phase of the job where everything was slightly louder than it needed to be in his nervous system, said, "Coalition Patrol Group is holding position, Commander. No movement. Weapons hot across all 14. We're getting comms requests from 11 different Coalition vessels, and 3 from the station." "Hold," Voss said. Park's hands hovered over his board. "All comms?" "All comms." He held. From the navigation station on the port side of the bridge, Lieutenant Osei's counterpart, a woman named Dara, who had been on 2 Titan postings and was therefore the second most senior non-Voss person in the room in terms of not letting her face do things it shouldn't, read off the sensor confirmation. Position locked. Distance 200 kilometers from Varath 9 outer hull. All systems nominal. Power levels holding at standard presence configuration, which was not a combat configuration, and was not a civilian configuration, and was a thing the Titan Division had invented specifically for situations like this one, because no existing category had fit. Confirmed, Voss said. She looked at the screen, at the 14 ships pointing at her, at the station beyond them, the one built to make things feel small, which from here was about the size of her thumbnail held at arm's length. She thought about the woman at the table in that station, the one with the gray in her hair, and the notebook, and the pen on top of the notebook, the one who had sat with her hands folded while 40 species decided humanity's future and then stood up and made a phone call. Voss had taken that call. She had said, "Understood." She had meant it completely. "Hold position," she said. "Do not respond to hails. Do not charge weapons. Do not maneuver." Park said, "And if they fire?" Voss looked at him. He looked at her. "They won't," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. He had asked that kind of question twice on his first week aboard Gravitas. And both times the answer had been the same answer, delivered the same way, in the same tone that was not unkind but was also not interested in elaborating. "Because they're not stupid." He turned back to his board. Voss turned back to her screen. She watched the 14 ships. She watched them hold. She watched the weapon signatures stay hot but unchanged, not climbing, not falling, the charge levels of things that have been activated as a statement rather than as a preparation. She waited. Outside the bridge viewports, the long, narrow ones that ran the width of the forward section, rated for impacts that no one had ever tried to make good on, the stars were very quiet. Gravitas was quiet too. Everything aboard it was quiet, not the quiet of absence, the quiet of held capacity, the quiet of a held breath, except the breath belonged to something 2.6 kilometers long, and the holding of it was a choice, and the choice was deliberate, and the deliberateness of it was the most important thing in the space between the ship and the station. On the observation deck of Varath 9, pressed against the transparency with his large eyes open as wide as they went, Kelthun watched it not move. He had studied humanity's military history. He had read the doctrines. He had read the accounts. He had read the after-action reports of the 3 conflicts humanity had been involved in before the Coalition had formally acknowledged their existence, conflicts the Coalition's records categorized as border incidents, which was what you called a thing when you did not want to admit the thing was a war and you were losing it. He had read all of it. He had thought he understood what he was reading. He had not understood. You could not understand it from documents. Documents gave you numbers and dates and the names of places. They did not give you this. They did not give you the specific quality of dark that a hull could be, or the specific quality of stillness that something this large could hold, or the specific quality of silence that descended over 4,000 beings behind him as they pressed against observation windows and looked at something that had not fired a single weapon and had nonetheless already changed everything. He pressed his hand flat against the transparency. He kept it there. Outside. Gravitas held its position against the stars, and the stars held their positions around it, and the space between the ship and the station was 200 kilometers of absolute quiet, and into that quiet, the Coalition's 14 patrol vessels broadcast their weapons signatures and received nothing back. Not defiance, not threat. Presence. Just the enormous, patient fact of it. Just the proof. The recess ended the way recesses always ended at Varath 9, with a tone, 3 notes, descending, the Coalition's way of saying, "Come back, sit down, we are not finished." The difference, this time, was that no one had left. They had pressed themselves against observation windows, and stood in corridors, and clustered at data terminals pulling the same sensor feeds the patrol vessels were broadcasting, and when the tone sounded, they turned from those windows with the slow reluctance of people who did not want to stop looking at the thing outside, because if they stopped looking at it, they would have to start thinking about what it meant. They came back to the chamber. They sat. The room that had been built to make things feel small was, for the first time, doing its job on the wrong species. Dakar walked to the head table. He walked the way he always walked, Measured, angular, unhurried. But there was a quality to it now that had not been there before. The quality of a man who has been told something and is deciding, with each step, how much of that something will show on the outside. He sat. He looked at the floor. He looked at his staff. His staff looked back. None of them spoke. He looked at the human table. Solis was already there. She had not gone to the observation windows. She had not gone to a data terminal. She had been at the table when the recess was called, and she was at the table when the delegates returned, and she was at the table now, with her notebook in front of her, and her pen on top of it, and her hands folded, and the fact that she was the only person in the chamber of first words who had not gone to look at the thing outside was the loudest thing in the room. She did not look at the head table. She looked at the far wall. Vance was beside her. His tablet was face down on the table in front of him, which was the first time it had been face down since he entered the building. He was looking at his hands. Ose had a new thermos. No one had noticed where it came from. Dakar opened his mouth. The presence of an unregistered vessel in coalition-controlled space. The Varath system is neutral space, Solis said. Not loudly, not with heat. The way you correct a small error in a document. Flat, precise, moving on. Dakar stopped. He started again. The presence of an unregistered vessel at a coalition diplomatic summit. The gravitas is registered. Solis reached into her jacket and placed a single folded document on the table. She did not unfold it. With the United Nations Space Command, under the Titan Vessel Registry Act of 2187, we provided that documentation to Coalition Traffic Coordination 48 hours before arrival. The documentation was acknowledged. Silence. At the head table, one of Dakar's senior staff bent very slightly toward another and said something in a register the room couldn't catch. The second staffer's expression did not change, but his hands, under the table edge where most of the room couldn't see them, flattened against his thighs in the specific way of someone receiving information they had hoped not to receive. Dakar said, "It is an act of hostility. It is not fired," Solis said. "It is not maneuvered. It is not hailed. It arrived at a legal position in neutral space, and it is holding that position." She paused for one beat. "Is presence an act of hostility, Admiral? You had 40 warship complements present when I walked in yesterday morning. I didn't call that hostile. I called it Tuesday. 4,000 beings." Not one of them made a sound. Kelthun was in his seat, the junior observer block, left side, row 9, a position specifically calibrated by coalition protocol to be in the room but not of it, present but peripheral, which was exactly where junior observers were supposed to be. He was not feeling peripheral. He was watching Solis the way he'd watched her at the table during the recess, with the same quality of attention he'd been trying and failing to put down since the moment she'd stood up and said she needed to make a call. There was something happening in the room that he could not fully name yet, but his body was ahead of his brain on it. That large-eye low-light sensation, the shape resolving in the dark, the thing becoming what it was. He had studied humanity's negotiation history, not the famous cases. The small ones, the ones that didn't make the records because they ended before there was anything official to record. The quiet negotiations, the ones where humanity had walked in disadvantaged and walked out with most of what they wanted, and the other party hadn't fully understood how until they were home reviewing the transcript. The pattern was always the same. They absorbed the first no. They absorbed it completely. No reaction, no visible recalibration, no face-saving countermove. They absorbed it the way soil absorbs water. And then they came back, and the second conversation was a different conversation, and the terms on the table were different terms, and the party who had said the first no found themselves somehow on the other side of something they hadn't seen coming. He was watching that happen. In real time. In the largest diplomatic chamber in coalition space. He pressed the edge of his thumbnail against the table in front of him. Hard. Grounding. "I would like to table a new document," Solis said. She reached into her jacket again. This time she produced not a folded page but a bound set of papers, the kind that had been printed and signed and sealed the old way, with a physical mark on a physical document, because some things were meant to be held in hands. She set it on the table. She did not slide it toward the head table. She left it in front of her. Dakar said, The session is not currently in a phase that permits new documentation. Then open a phase that does, Solis said. Or I can wait. She looked at the document. I'm comfortable either way. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of procedural exchange between Dakar and his staff. The specific friction of a process being forced into a shape it wasn't built for by someone who had clearly done the procedural reading before arriving. At the end of those 4 minutes, the session was formally open to new documentation under Subclause 7 of the Coalition Summit Conduct Framework, which permitted new documentation under specific circumstances, one of which was the formal request of an observer delegation. Solis picked up the document. She began to read. She read it without inflection, which was the worst possible way to read it, because inflection would have given the room something to respond to: indignation, negotiating posture, the signal of where the soft edges were. Inflection would have said, "These are our opening terms." No inflection said, "These are our terms." The document had 9 points. Point 1. Full coalition membership, effective upon ratification of the current agreement, with no probationary period and no protected status classification. Point 2. Human expansion zones, as currently defined by the Unsea Boundary Register, to be recognized as sovereign territory, not subject to coalition monitoring or movement restriction. Point 3. A permanent seat on the Coalition Security Council, with full veto rights, effective immediately upon ratification. She kept reading. Points 4 through 7 were technical: trade frameworks, technology exchange protocols, a joint commission on non-aligned species development. Not small, but not the points the room was attending to. The room was attending to 1 through 3. Point 8 was a timeline: 90 days to ratification, 60 days to seat occupancy, no extensions. Point 9 was short. She read it. In the event this agreement is not ratified within the stated timeline, the signatories acknowledge that the terms of engagement between the United Nations Earth and the Galactic Coalition will revert to a state of non-agreement, as existed prior to Earth's application for observer status, and all parties will proceed accordingly. She set the document down. She folded her hands. She waited. The room did not explode. It would have been easier if it had exploded. Noise was familiar. Noise was a reaction, and reactions could be managed, addressed, absorbed into the procedure. What the room did instead was go into a specific kind of silence that had pressure in it, the silence of a structure that is recalculating load. Dakar was very still. He was looking at the document from across the floor. Then he said, "This is coercion." "This is an offer," Solis said. "You have positioned a warship outside this station." "Yes. That ship is the coercion." Solis looked at him. Something moved across her face, not emotion, something beneath emotion, the tectonic thing that emotions are built on top of. It was there, and then it was gone. "Admiral," she said, "that ship has been there for 6 hours. It has not fired. It has not moved. It has not broadcast a single hostile communication. It is present." She paused. "If the presence of a ship changes the terms of a negotiation, then I would like to point out that you have had coalition warships orbiting this station for 3 days. I did not cite that as coercion." Another pause, shorter. "I cited it as context." Keltoon felt his thumbnail pressing hard enough into the table edge to hurt. He left it there. From row 9 of the junior observer block, he raised his hand. He raised it the old way, the Thunari way. Flat palm forward, elbow at shoulder height, the formal gesture that predated coalition protocol by 800 years and was recognized by every species in the room, because it had been the gesture used at the first accords, and every species had been shown the image of it in their standard coalition history curriculum. It meant, "I speak from conscience." It had not been used in this chamber in 40 years. Dakar looked at him. Every head in the room turned. Kelthun did not lower his hand. "I second the motion to open the document for ratification discussion," he said. He said it the way you say a thing you have been thinking about for a long time and have finally decided to stop just thinking. Level, clear, the specific calm of a decision already made. The room stared at him. He was a junior observer. Row 9, left side. He was not a speaking member. He had no formal voting weight in this chamber. The seconding of a motion by a non-voting observer was not, technically, procedurally valid. It was also not, technically, procedurally invalid. The Coalition Summit Conduct Framework had never specified that non-voting observers could not second motions because no non-voting observer had ever tried to second a motion. The procedure simply had no rule about it, which meant, under the Coalition's own framework, which defaulted to permission in the absence of prohibition, that what he had just done was allowed. He had done the procedural reading too. Dakar knew it. Kelthun watched him know it. He lowered his hand. "I've read their history," Kelthun said. "Not to Dakar, to the room. We should have done this 3 years ago." The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. The before silence had pressure in it. This silence had a different quality. The quality of a room that has heard something true said aloud in a place where true things are rarely said aloud, and does not know yet what to do with it. Dakar looked at him for a long moment. Then Dakar looked away. He looked at his staff. He looked at the document on the floor of the chamber. He looked at the delegates, 40 species, the faces he had been reading for 30 years, and he read them now, and what he read was what he had not wanted to read, which was, "The room has shifted, and I am the last one to feel it." He said, "The session will recess for deliberation." Solis nodded once. She picked up her pen. She put it on top of her notebook. She folded her hands. Outside the station, 200 kilometers of quiet space away, Gravitas held its position, and held its position, and held its position, the dark of its hull against the dark of space, patient as stone, patient as math, patient as the specific kind of thing that does not need to make a threat, because what it is has already said everything. The Coalition went to deliberate. The document sat on the table. It waited. It was not going anywhere. The deliberation took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Kelthun knew because he counted. Not with a clock. With the specific attention of a person who has nothing to do but wait, and has decided that waiting is itself a form of work. He sat in row 9, and he watched the chamber empty and refill with the low-level traffic of a room in recess. Aides moving documents, staff conferring in corners, the occasional delegate walking past with the face of someone doing math they don't like the answer to. And he counted the minutes, the way you count stones across a river. One at a time, looking only at the next one. 4 hours and 11 minutes. Then Dakar came back. He walked differently. Still measured. Still angular. Still the walk of a species that had evolved precision into its bones. But there was something missing from it that had been there before. The quality Kelthun had always privately categorized as arrival weight, the specific gravity of a person who enters rooms believing the rooms have been waiting for them. The room had not waited for Dakar. The room had waited for the document. He sat. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Solis, who was where she had been when he left, in the same position, with the same folded hands, and the notebook in front of her, and the pen on the notebook. And Kelthun had the irrational thought that she might not have moved at all, that she had sat there in the empty chamber for 4 hours and 11 minutes in exactly that position, waiting, not because she had to, but because moving would have meant something, and she had decided that nothing was going to mean anything until Dakar came back. Dakar said, "The Coalition cannot ratify these terms as presented. One beat. 3 of the 9 points are areas where we are prepared to move toward agreement. The remaining 6 require significant revision before." "No," Solis said. Not loud, not fast. Just, no. Dakar stopped. "The document is complete," she said. "All 9 points. Unrevised. Diplomat Solis. Admiral." She looked at him. Not over him, not past him. At him. "You had 2 years to negotiate. The application period was 2 years. We submitted documentation, attended every scheduled review session, answered 642 formal queries from 3 independent committees." She paused. "We were told no, 11 hours ago, in this room." She touched the edge of her notebook with one finger. This is what no produces. The room did not move. 4,000 bodies. Not one of them breathed loud enough to matter. Dakar looked at the document on the floor. The document did not look back. It just sat there the way documents sit. Flat, patient, permanent. He said, "If we do not reach agreement today, then we don't," Solis said. Point 9. Outside Varath 9, The Coalition fleet moved. Not all of it. 7 of the 14 patrol vessels pulling from their holding positions and resolving into something with more intentionality than the scramble shape they'd been holding for the last 6 hours. A formation. Real this time. Coordinated. The kind of geometry that meant someone had made a decision and transmitted it, and received confirmations back. They moved toward gravitas. On the bridge, Park said, 7 contacts, Commander. Bearing. They're coming at us. Weapons still hot. Distance closing. Voss looked at her screen. 7 ships. She pulled their class signatures without asking. 3 mid-range Coalition patrol cruisers. 2 heavy escorts. 1 tactical command vessel. 1 she didn't have a firm classification on, but whose energy output suggested it was carrying something it hadn't been born with. An aftermarket weapons package. The kind that got bolted on when someone decided their standard loadout was insufficient for a specific conversation. She looked at all 7 of them on her screen. She drank her coffee. Park's hands were above his board, not on it, which was either discipline or the specific paralysis of a person waiting for an order that would tell him what kind of day this was. They're at 40 kilometers, Commander. I know, she said. 35. I know. They're not hailing. I know. She set her coffee down. She looked at her screen. 7 ships at 32 kilometers and closing. Weapons live. No hail. No warning. The specific behavior of a fleet that has been told to make a statement with motion rather than language. They were not going to fire. She knew this the way she knew which clouds meant rain. Not from the science of it, which she also knew, but from the longer knowledge, the one that lives below the mind and doesn't need to explain itself. They were bluffing. They were bluffing, and they were going to keep bluffing right up until the point where bluffing was no longer a position available to them, and then they were going to make a choice, and the choice they made was going to tell her something about how the next 100 years of human coalition relations were going to feel. She let them come. 20 kilometers. 15. Commander. Park's voice was doing a thing it wasn't supposed to do. Hold, she said. 10 kilometers. She picked up her coffee. She held it. She looked at the 7 contacts on her screen and she felt, not fear, not anticipation, something older and quieter than either of those, the feeling of a very old piece of machinery that has been running a very long time and knows exactly what it is. And she said, quietly, to no one, now. She had not touched her weapons board. She had not given an order. What she had done was this. She had opened the weapons port covers. All of them. Every port along the port broadside of Uns. Gravitas. And there were many. The specific many of something that had been designed by people who understood that capability shown is more fluent than capability used. Opened simultaneously. The way a hand opens when it stops being a fist. Not a targeting lock. Not a charge sequence. Not the pre-fire signature that every combat system in the Coalition's fleet was programmed to recognize. Just open. Here they are. Count them if you want. The 7 ships stopped. 1 second. 2. 7 Coalition vessels sitting at 9 kilometers from the hull of Gravitas. With their weapons hot and their port covers. All of them, the count was wrong. The count the recognition database had produced was wrong. It had estimated based on vessel length and standard Titan class specifications, and the estimate had been wrong. The actual number was higher, significantly higher, in the way that changes the shape of a calculation, staring back at them. 9 kilometers. No one on those 7 ships fired. At 9 kilometers from that hull, in the specific silence of 7 crews who had run the number once, and were now running it again hoping it would change, the math was very simple. It did not change. The first ship powered its weapons down at 11 seconds. Not fast, not with the theatrical suddenness of surrender, slowly, the way a person who has been holding something too heavy sets it down, with full awareness of what the setting down means, without pretending it means something else. The second ship followed at 14 seconds, the third at 17. By 30 seconds, all 7 were dark. They held position at 9 kilometers. They did not retreat. They were not required to retreat, and they did not. That much dignity stayed intact. But they were dark, and Gravitas was open, and the space between them had the quality of a question that has received its answer, and is now waiting for everyone in the room to catch up. On the station, Dakar's personal comm went off. He looked at it. He looked at Solis. He put the comm down on the table in front of him, face up, and he left it there, and he sat with the specific stillness of a man who has just been handed a report he was hoping not to receive. He knew what it said. He did not need to read it to know. He had 31 staff members and 40 species behind him and 11 centuries of institutional history, and across the floor of the Chamber of First Words, a woman with gray in her hair and a notebook in front of her was sitting with her hands folded, looking at him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, with the mild, attentive expression of a person who has been patient for a long time and is still patient and will be patient for as long as it takes and is completely comfortable with however long that turns out to be. He picked up his pen. He pulled the document toward him. He signed. Not everything. Not gracefully. Points 4 through 7 required annotation. He wrote his objections in the margin, small and precise, the handwriting of a man who is preserving the record of his objections for a future that might care about them. He initialed each annotation. He was thorough about it. He was going to be thorough about it. Solis let him. She sat and she waited, and she let him be thorough, because thoroughness was something she understood, and because there was no reason to hurry him, and because the document was going to say what it said regardless of how long it took to get there. When he finished, he pushed it across the floor. She pulled it toward her. She looked at it. She turned to page 3, which was where the signatures went, and she looked at his signature for a moment, and then she picked up her pen, and she signed below it, and she set the pen down, and she folded her hands. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. He did not respond. He stood, he said, in the flat procedural tone of a man completing a task. "The summit is adjourned." He nodded to his staff. He walked out through the main doors, the large ones, the 20-meter ones, the ones that took 4 staff members to operate. They closed behind him. The room breathed. Kelthun did not move from row 9. He sat while the room emptied around him, the clusters breaking, the species filing out, the 4,000 becoming hundreds, becoming dozens, becoming a chamber with chairs and amber lighting, and the polished obsidian floor reflecting everything in its perfect inverse. He sat until he was one of 6 people left in the room, and then he sat longer. He was looking at the observation window on the far side of the hall. He could not see out. Gravitas. From this angle, he knew it was there. He thought about the document, the one now signed and transmitted and being processed through coalition ratification infrastructure, at whatever speed bureaucracies move when they have no choice about the direction. He thought about Solis's face when she signed it, no different from her face at any other point in the last 36 hours. The same flat patience, the same folded hands, the same quality of a person to whom outcome and waiting had become the same thing. He thought about what he had said. "We should have done this 3 years ago." He thought about the way the room had looked at him. He did not regret it. That was the thing about doing the right thing too late. You could still do it. The lateness was its own record, but the doing was also its own record, and he preferred to be in the second record than only in the first. He stood. He picked up his untouched plate of food, still on the seat beside him from the reception, cold and long past eating. He set it on the empty seat. He walked to the observation window. Gravitas was visible from here, at this angle, just barely, the upper dorsal line of it catching the distant star's light, a long dark seam against the star field, patient and still, the same as it had been since it arrived. The weapons ports were closed now. It was just the hull, just the shape. He pressed his hand against the transparency. He stood there. He was still standing there when the station's automated systems began signaling Gravitas for departure clearance. He watched it receive the clearance. He watched it begin to move. It did not hurry. That was the thing about it. It had never hurried. It had arrived without hurrying, and it had held position without hurrying, and now it turned with the slow, massive deliberateness of something that has weight enough to do everything slowly, and speed enough to do everything faster than anyone could stop it. And those two things existed in it simultaneously, without contradiction, and the contradiction of them was the whole point. It was going home. The drive signature was not visible. No bloom, no wash, the same absence of evidence that had attended its arrival. And then it was smaller, and then it was a point, and then it was not there. The space where it had been was empty. Varath 9 hung in the star field, and the patrol vessels hung around it, and the stars hung where they had always hung, and everything was where it had been before, except that it wasn't, except that the signed document was in the system, and the seats were allocated, and the galaxy had been reshuffled by a ship that never fired a shot, and a woman who never raised her voice, and one junior observer in row 9, who had raised his hand the old way. On the bridge of gravitas. At the jump threshold, Voss was in her chair. She had her coffee. Park said, "Coalition confirmation received, Commander. Signing is confirmed. Ratification process is live." He paused. He looked at his board. He looked at her. "We did it." She drank her coffee. She looked at the stars. He waited. He had learned to wait. After a moment he said, because he needed to know, because he was 26, and this was his first Titan posting, and he thought maybe he had a right to this particular answer. Were we going to fire? If they hadn't signed? She looked at him. He held the look. "We had the authorization," she said. He let that sit for 1 second. 2. "That's not what I asked." She drank her coffee. She looked at the stars. She did not answer. Park turned back to his board. He did not ask again. The galaxy was very quiet. Not the quiet of absence. The galaxy was never quiet that way. Always somewhere something was burning, building, breaking, beginning. The quiet was different. The specific quiet of 40 species, going home to their governments with a document that changed the shape of the next 100 years, and needing time to sit with it before they spoke, because some things are too large for immediate words. The quiet of a room after a very large thing has moved through it and left. The quiet of the Thunari observer who stood at the observation window for a long time after the point of light disappeared, his hand flat against the transparency, his large eyes open, watching the space where the ship had been. Not because the ship was still there, because he was paying attention to what the empty space felt like now, compared to what it had felt like before. It felt different. It felt like something that had been decided. He took his hand off the glass. He walked toward the east corridor, toward the exit, toward the long process of whatever came next. Behind him, the chamber of first words was empty. The amber lights were still on. The obsidian floor still reflected everything in its perfect inverse. The chairs, the tables, the high ceiling, the small placard near the center of the floor that read, "United Nations Earth, Observer Status," which was already technically wrong, which would be replaced by "Morning," with something that said something else. The galaxy had watched gravitas go, and for the first time in 1,000 years of recorded history, the galaxy was very, very quiet.